our legislative subcommittee meeting. At this time, it is about 4:04. Do we need to take attendance?
We need to call the meeting to order, and yes, we do need to, before we take attendance, public communication on posted items. Is there any public communication on posted items?
We have not been notified of any.
Okay, so now we can move
Go
forward.
ahead and call the meeting to order,
Mm-hmm.
and we will start with agenda item number 1.
First item is the adoption of February 6, 2023 minutes.
Second?
And these are against recommendation to move forward to the full body of the board. So, correct. Okay. So they will be moved forward
And
based on
second.
this conversation.
Second by Lopez Cepeda. And,
And
oh, any comments, questions? No? So let's call for the vote.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, with that, we'll move it forward to the full body of the board. All right, next up is legislative update, new laws and pending legislation. And for that, we have Mr. Kevin Gordon from Capital Advisors, who provides us with support out of Sacramento. So, Mr. Gordon, if you would please provide us with a brief legislative update, kind of some going-ons in our state's capital.
You bet. Happy to be with. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Super good. Okay, yeah. Let me give you a little bit of an update, a kind of the latest. I mean, the good news is the legislature's on vacation. So that means the people of California are safe at least for 30 days. And, but there's a lot that they're going to come back to because we're in the midst of, sort of the first several months of a 2-year legislative session. And so when they come back, they're going to be hitting a bunch of bills that you guys may or may not have heard about earlier from stuff that we've written and shared with the district. But I'm just going to give you an update of key issues. One of which is an issue that's been pretty much wrapped up, but it's extremely important across the state with regard to charter schools.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that there was the legislation running, but as well, there was a major court case. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with this court case that was taken up, but it was Napa Valley Unified School District that had basically denied a charter. And the way the new law works, it was AB 1505. It basically gives you as a governing board a whole lot more authority about charters than you've ever had before, essentially saying that if a charter petitioner comes to you or a charter's up for renewal, and when you do the analysis, you come to the conclusion that, for example, one of the issues is that it has an adverse impact on all of the kids in the district-wide, from a fiscal standpoint or even educational standpoint, you can basically deny the charter. That didn't used to be the law. Most of charter school rules used to be built around, is it good or not for the kids that will go to the charter? So for a charter petitioner, all you had to prove is that what you were going to be doing was good, even if it ended up being at the expense of the financial stability of the rest of the whole district, pulling kids out and the rest of the district collapses or whatever. You couldn't consider that. When they added that, there are a lot of people who are big charter school supporters who said, if that ends up really being the standard, then we're never going to see charter schools adopted again because governing boards will just simply say no based on fiscal impact because they're always going to be able to find something. Well, despite that argument, the charter school community, the big advocates for charter schools, did not end up winning that argument in the legislation that was done a couple of years ago. And it was called 1505. Fast forward to this litigation where Napa Valley Unified said no to the renewal of a charter. And when they said no to that renewal, it then got appealed like it normally would to the County Board of Education. But under the new rubric, the new world we live in, when it gets appealed to the county, the only thing a county can decide up or down is, did you follow process? They can't re-argue whether it's a good charter or not. It's just, did they follow the process correctly? The county in that case upheld the district's decision. So then the charter school people appealed to the State Board of Education. And when the State Board of Education looked at it, there was a lot of pressure that was brought to bear by, sort of titans of the charter school community. And the state board decided it's kind of a good charter, at least in their opinion. And they ended up reversing what was decided at the district and the county board level and let the charter go forward. So Napa Valley Unified sued, and basically they've won it in a lower court decision where the court said, you missed the point here, state board. You can only undo a charter if somebody messed up on process. You can't give them another chance to argue why they're good. This isn't about being good or bad. It's about process. In 1505, when it was passed, limited it to that. So this court case is a really big deal. The charter school that where basically the denial was upheld by the courts and they reversed what the state board did, the charter school is going to actually appeal that to a higher court. So when they go to an appeals court, I think it's a pretty slam dunk case. The appeals court is going to side with the judge at the Superior Court level, and they'll probably uphold this. But what it means is greater local control. Districts, county offices together have more power and say over charter schools than they ever had before. And this sort of locks in or memorializes what's going on with that legislation. So that court case happened. And the reason why I'm sort of giving you an update on it, because in addition to that court case, which is rather recent, literally in the last 60 days, the legislature, when they did the budget this year, put language in the budget that basically said, no matter what happens in the court case, we're going to actually tighten up the language that's in the law, and we're going to do it through the budget bill. And they did. They took a number of steps to say in statute now going forward, redoubling that affirmation that it's the governing board and the local LEAs that have authority over this issue, that if they say no, they get to say no, and the only way to appeal it is if they didn't follow the rules. And on process, you can't relitigate the merits of the charter. So that language went into the Budget Act, and it got adopted and signed by the governor. So the charter school world is definitely controversial, but they've erred on the side of sort of a perspective that represents local control. And I don't know how many charter school petitions you guys have as a board, and Moises, you might know whether you guys have people coming to you or what your disposition is, but this is going to put more basically power in the hands of the board and the governance team in the district to really evaluate charters and decide whether or not it's a good fit. So that was issue number one. Any comments on that? Anybody have a question about the charter school world?
I was just going to say, Kevin, for us, we actually don't have a large number of charter schools. I think where it's going to come into play fairly soon is there is a charter in our neighborhood that was locally denied at the county and then approved at the state board at inception. And so they are likely to be coming up on renewal. That's where that issue might come up. But we're still about a year out from actually having to deal with that.
And that's a really good point that I wanted to underscore, is that there was another truce made between the charter school people and our labor partners with CTA that are a dominant player in the charter school fights, where the charter schools really wanted to push out for another 2 years any kind of renewal kinds of fights. So you get basically an automatic extension for another 2 years. CTA said we would give you a year, but in exchange for that year, there's going to be a moratorium that no district can approve anywhere in the state, a non-classroom based charter. So that moratorium goes into effect for also another year. So basically nothing's going to happen for a year, but when that year does pass, there's going to be lots of renewals up, and then the provisions of this statute and the power that a local board has is going to be very, very powerful and important, because again, a bunch of charters are going to be coming up for renewal, and basically you're going to be put in a position where you have the power to decide it, but you're also going to be in the unenviable position of being in the middle of probably some controversial fights potentially. That'll happen for governing boards all over the state. So that's that one issue. I had written a little update about Congress, 2 developments at the federal level that I wanted to let you know about. One that's exciting and it's really important, and that is the reintroduction of the bill that would do full funding of special ed. It was run in the last Congress, and it was debated over a couple of years, and it didn't end up going anywhere. And my argument is one of the reasons why it didn't go very far is because it wasn't bipartisan. They didn't have any Republican co-authors. And of course, with the House of Representatives being Republican, you need to have some Republicans if you're going to make progress on that. So basically, the bill didn't go anywhere. This time it's been reintroduced by the same two principal authors. Jared Huffman's a congressman from way up in the Sonoma area of California, and Chris Von Hollen. Von Hollen is a U.S. Senator from Maryland. And Chris and Jared both have co-authored the bill, but they got 60 co-authors and at least a half a dozen Republicans on that piece of legislation. And so there's a major effort afoot right now to try to get even more Republicans on board the bill that would fully fund the federal share of special ed, which would bring us their share up to 40%. And it would phase that in over a multi-year period. Most people think it would take a 10-year period based on the formula. It's pretty much identical to the legislation that was introduced a couple of years ago, but it's a new, fresh bill. We have a sample resolution, other kinds of things to the degree that the board wants to get active. This is referenced in the platforms that I'm going to be talking about later for the district, and it's consistent with what you guys as a district had in your last platform, which is how do we get to full funding of special education. So that's a development that's literally happened in the last 30 days, the introduction of that legislation. The other thing on the federal front is that the House of Representatives did vote for a budget for education that would cut education spending by about between 26 and 28% across all programs except special ed, which they have flat funded, but most programs are cut. But the biggest cut comes to Title I. Clearly, our district has to be concerned about Title I because we get a good dose of total Title I money. And that cut is an 80% cut. The good news is that Republicans in the House of Representatives who lead that House are the ones proposing it, and the Democrats who lead the U.S. Senate, albeit by only one vote. But even the Republicans in the Senate, we don't think would support cuts of that depth to any education program. Even when they've been in charge in the past of the Senate, Republicans in the Senate have not backed any kind of cuts to education spending. So it would have to get over that hurdle, and then it'd have to be signed by the president. Joe Biden's not going to sign a budget that cuts special ed Title I by 80% or education spending. His budget, the president's budget, increases overall federal spending for education by 14%. So it goes the opposite direction. So that's a very recent development, Congress's vote to cut education spending, even though it's probably going to fall flat. Remember, kind of our goal in a divided Congress on the budget, since we won't be able to probably get any big increases passed, will be stalemate, because if they can't do anything, then we basically get prior year budget. So that means they can't cut anything. We'll get at least last year's budget. So that's kind of what's going on with regard to the federal budget. So that federal budget is just special ed, the charter school, and last but not least, the State Board of Education adopting the math framework. And that was done. They've put several years into this effort, a multi-year effort, to put a framework together on mathematics. They did adopt it. It's not without some controversy. And there are a number of kind of core ideas that are involved with that adoption. And I'm not sure it's going to end up being controversial in your district, but if you guys have questions about that, we can definitely answer them. We have two people on our staff who are really close to all of the developments regarding the math framework, and they can handle that. And then finally, the last thing is that a school bond for the 2024 ballot, two pieces of legislation are still advancing. So I'm very confident that they are going to get legislation passed in time to put a bond on the ballot in 2024. One of the two measures would put it on the March primary, just next March. The other puts it into November. We tend to think November makes more political sense because we've never had a November statewide education bond that went down to defeat, where we've had, bond measures on primary ballots that actually have been defeated, including the last one, just only 2 years ago, was Prop 13. So those two pieces of legislation, they're kind of competing measures, are making their way forward. We hope that the one that carries a November bond measure is the one that prevails. It, by the way, also has money in it for pre-K, TK facilities. So that's important distinction over what we've seen before in prior bond measures. That'll be really, really important.
Do we have some amounts and where money would go under those bonds?
Yeah, there's one measure that's a $15 billion bond measure by Steve Glazier, but it includes UC and CSU, so higher education. We know that when you include those two institutions, the number of votes in favor tends to drop a little bit. So that's why you have Al Maritsucci, the chairman of the Assembly Budget Education Committee, who strongly wants to leave them out. But he has a $14 billion bond, and it would cover pre-K all the way through community college. And his is $14 billion, $1 billion less. The question is whether or not we're able to sustain a bond measure that's that high when the governor has other priorities he's trying to do. He's trying to do a bond on homelessness. He's trying to do something on environment, on climate change. And to the extent that he puts those kinds of things on the ballot, he's openly stated that he doesn't want more than $30 billion worth of debt put before the voters in 2024. So to the extent that our school stuff uses up almost half of that, we think in the negotiation with the governor, that dollar amount might come down a little bit. I would really like it if it doesn't, because we really do need those dollars to sort of infuse with money our modernization and new construction funds. You guys have plenty of modernization needs, and I'm not sure what kind of new construction needs that you might have, but modernization should be a big priority, I think.
Who
for
again is the
Sweetwater.
author of that education bill?
So AB 247 is the Maritsucci bill.
Mark
And he's
Tucci?
chairman. Yeah, it's
Maritsucci.
Maritsucci, Muratsucchi. He's a Democrat from Torrance and chairman of the Ed Committee. And
And
then
again, the number?
Glazier, SB 28 is by Steve Glazier, Glazer. And he was super close. He ran all of Jerry Brown's political campaigns, and he decided to run for office himself, and he won. He's a moderate Democrat. He's constantly causing some consternation as a moderate to conservative Democrat with some of our friends in labor, but he's up there moving a school bond. He's in a good place on wanting there to be a bond. The only difference is he wants it to include higher ed, which a lot of folks in the ed community are not crazy about. So,
Thank you.
K-12 community, you betcha.
I have a question going back to the math framework.
Yes.
Did they go in and modify or take out the Common Core?
No, it didn't. In fact, I'll tell you that, in fact, it says it's built around these core ideas, and there's just a few of them. One is, and these are, fundamental, all students can achieve and be successful in math, encouraging all students to get as far and deep into math as possible.
Oh, those are the
Provide-
practices. Those are the practices,
Yes.
not the core. Okay, so
Yeah.
there's 6 or 8 of them, right?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, okay.
Or 7. You
There
got
were
it.
8 before.
Yeah, and if you need me, we did a little write-up just on this issue, and I can resend that to Moises so you guys can take a look at that if you need it.
Thank you.
Great. So that's kind of my update. If you guys have, obviously there's lots of other legislation that's floating around, the enrollment versus ADA bill, which I'm not sure is going to go very far. There are a number of other little developments going on. There's the bill that would sort of mess with, Temecula Unified School District with regard to curriculum adoption. That's going to probably go all the way through and be signed by the governor. We're a little concerned about its implications for governance. But that's a bill that's out there that's likely to go forward. And it's simply, it has a higher threshold for boards if they're going to end up trying to, prohibit the use of an existing textbook. There are requirements on that. So 2/3 vote to remove a textbook or other instructional materials that you would have on a normal adoption schedule, and outright prohibition on the use of an existing textbook or other instructional materials or curriculum that contains inclusive or diverse perspectives. So, and that bill is like flying through the process because, of course, Democrat control of the legislature, and it's become so politicized, they want to lock that down. But again, one of the things that we were really trying to caution the legislature about is being really careful on those bills not to end up putting in policy that would empower some other extreme. If someday the politics change in California, you're setting bad precedences for the legislature to get involved with taking away local control. So CSBA is doing a really good job of making sure that that governance perspective is articulated at the Capitol. Okay, that's pretty much the update, unless you guys have any other questions.
Okay. Will you keep us posted on the status of the federal attempts to cut education funding? Do you know of any hearings that have been scheduled? Have any votes actually been taken? Or is this just in committee and discussion at this point?
Yeah, right now it is just passed through committee. So yeah, no progress beyond that. And honestly, because they're going to end up, once it gets through the House of Representatives, it's going to have to be conferenced with the Senate. Mm-hmm. And again, the U.S. Senate's never going to agree to it. But the reason why I put it out there, I'm kind of glad you raised the issue. I got blowback from some of my people, my colleagues here in the firm, about why are you putting out sort of news about what the cut is when the likelihood of it happening is pretty much zero. And my answer was because every time when Democrats have been in control of Congress and they do something, we report the action of Congress. The House of Representatives did X. Well, just because the Republicans are in charge, I think they need to own it. And I don't know if any of you guys actually, you guys did go back to the Coast to Coast conference, right?
Correct.
So when we were back there, you might remember there was a lot of dialogue about sort of, hey, there's education advocates on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, and we're all rowing it. We have a little bit slightly different perspective, but give it equal weight. What I wanted to do is make sure that everybody understood real clearly that there are some in Congress that want to cut public education spending. And we know there's plenty of people with R's or D's after the name that if they support public education, they certainly don't want to see it cut, including people like Mitch McConnell and John Thune of South Dakota. These are leadership of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate, don't want to see cuts to education. Mm-hmm. So when the House puts together a budget that cuts public schools by as dramatically the big numbers as they're trying to cut, I mean, an 80% cut to Sweetwater's Title I funding would be very significant money. Mm-hmm. And we just need to call it out. Even though I'm very optimistic it'll never come to pass, we do need to report that they've taken that position so that folks can be sort of accountable for the fact that that's the view they have and they're voting for it. So we just want to make sure that was out there. But yeah, we'll keep you guys very much apprised of this as it goes through the budget stuff. These are the updates when it comes to budgets at the federal level that I write myself. So we did put that together. And same with the special ed issue.
All right. Aside from the few who are those who are advocating these enormous cuts, do you have a list of people who are doing that so that we might be able to contact our delegation to lean on them, to get us information from those offices and so forth? We really do need to stay on top of this. I don't want any Friday night surprises or something about.
Absolutely.
We got to ride this one for sure.
Yeah. One of the things you should know on the special ed issue, and kind of you trigger a thought about maybe we ought to be applying this to overall budget issues as well. We went to a luncheon in DC while we were back there during Coast to Coast that the California delegation has every Wednesday. It's all the Democrats from California. And we went in and we talked about special ed, we talked about the budget, and they looked at it and said, you know what, you're preaching to the choir. We're already with you. You got to get to key members that are on the key committee, which is the Education Workforce Committee in other states. So we came up with this idea that we put together a correspondence from some of the leadership, the education leadership in California, represented by superintendents like Moises, where you're writing to the superintendents of districts that we've identified that correlate with House Republicans that are from other states. And then we even wrote the letter that superintendent in that city, in another state, in the right district of that member of Congress would send their member of Congress to articulate the issue. So build a campaign that's a superintendent to superintendent conversation or a board to board conversation about, hey, we would love, these are imperative issues. We need your congressman on board and we want it to be bipartisan. Can you please communicate something like the attached letter to your member of Congress so they support education? And that's on the special ed issue. So, and we ran a list of every single Republican that's on the Education Workforce Committee, as well as on the Senate side, the Senate, what we call the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension. They have jurisdiction. And so we've got kind of this advocacy roadmap of how to get more bipartisan support across the country, rather than we talk to our own member of Congress and our own members of Congress in California say, we're already on board, we're with you. But, you know, we all know that we do have a Republican delegation from California as well, and most of them did sign on for those budget cuts. So we got to communicate with them. So your point is super well taken.
Kevin, just one other question. I know as part of the 80% cut that you're talking about, just confirm if I'm right, the House Republicans are also planning as part of that to cut the block grant for nutrition services, given that the Keep Kids Fed Act sunset on June 30th, where we already lost 15 cents per breakfast and 40 cents per lunch. So is that, in addition to the Title I 80% cut, we're seeing a big old cut in
Yes.
actually feeding our kids, which is obviously one of our priorities, especially for making sure our employees have health insurance.
It's those cuts on the way to an objective that's been very much reported and is out there to overtly block any federal money that would provide for universal meals. They're totally against it, which again is, guys, the very first time I ever heard about universal meals and feeding all kids was from a Republican. And it was a Republican from Connecticut who's now retired, but he was the one that made the argument that you probably save money by feeding all kids. It's good for kids too, by the way, instead of worrying about who qualifies and who doesn't and all the bureaucracy that goes with that. And he made a really good point. And here you have House Republicans taking exactly the opposite viewpoint, which is just to be, I think, have a difference of opinion with Democrats over universal feeding. It just doesn't make sense. But you're right, that's a major additional policy issue that's attached to their budget objectives. All right. Anything else?
Okay,
Well,
so,
it just sounds like we've got our work cut out for us here.
and it's about being strategic, I think, as Kevin said, because thankfully our delegation is very much in support, I think, is how can we seek to support those who may be in areas where delegations may not be as supportive, and so that is not necessarily a direct, but an indirect approach. And so I know Kevin and his team are very focused on that.
And then the other thing I'll mention too is that when we had our little agenda setting, when we were talking about the ledge platform, you guys are the ones that piped in on some of the things that we had in the draft. And we added, you'll see it when we get to it under federal legislative priorities, a big section on school nutrition and federal school meals programs. And so consistent with what you're saying right now about, hey, we need to keep our eyes on that and we need to be advocating on that. It's one of just the handful, 5 issues that are in the federal legislative platform, the draft. So you'll see that there when we get to it. All right.
All right, so thank you so much, Kevin. So now we can move on to the next item in the agenda, which is review of draft of 23-24 legislative platform in anticipation of taking it to the full body of the board for approval. So I'll ask Jenny to provide any context that may be important, and we can have some dialogue and discussion. Jenny?
Sure. I thank you. And as you'll remember, in the February meeting, we reviewed a draft of what had been previously approved or previously put forward. We looked at the 21-22, and then Kevin had put together 22-23. We gave him some suggestions for this based from this committee, and Kevin and team revised state and federal legislative priorities, as he just mentioned, for 23-24. So what we would be asking is that you give any final feedback that we would have on this 23-24 state and then federal legislative priorities, and then from that we vote to recommend this to the board at the meeting that we take next meeting. And so when we present our report, which Ms. Cepeda Lopez, because she's the the head of that, sitting in that room, she would be presenting that this was a recommendation coming out of this subcommittee for the board to approve these legislative priorities. So the real question here, Kevin, do you want to take just 30 seconds and kind of go through
Yep.
the big bullets, the changes you made, and then we can ask questions and go from there?
Yep. So one of the things, just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, Jenny, is that the committee, as you guys might remember, had a very extensive conversation about both of these platforms and injected a number of priorities that you wanted to see underscored in these. One of the areas that we talked about overall fiscal objectives, we call it fiscal resiliency, was to not lose sight of the fact that even though the legislature had made progress on the whole idea of ADA protection, because obviously in the aftermath of COVID, we had a drop in attendance. And one of the things that you guys wanted to underscore, which I've done in this draft here, is that even though they did a hold harmless for one fiscal year, and they created what's called the 3-year rolling average for ongoing declines in ADA, that there's a sustained problem that we're having with attendance that we actually need help with, or it's really going to hurt us financially in the future. That issue, we had a difficult budget year this year, and there were a number of things that we did get in the budget that were positive. Amazing, honestly, for a budget year that's supposed to be bad, like we got a full 8.22% COLA. But the bad news is they didn't do anything to help us on this drop in ADA. So you guys made it a priority. We've written up language to go with that on the average daily attendance item that says they're loss protections. And it addresses this issue that, God bless you for what you did, but we're not done. We need to really revisit that ADA issue. So that's one issue. The second was making sure that they're paying attention to base education funding. Obviously, an 8.22% COLA that we got in the current year certainly helps with that. But one of the things that we've always articulated, and you guys do as well here, is that giving us some increases in the base beyond COLA is what we really need to do to be competitive, because a COLA, a cost of living adjustment, only keeps you even with what you did in the prior year. It enables you to pay for the same thing you did last year, next year, but it doesn't give anything more than that. If you really want to shore up the base for the long term, we need to make sure that base funding becomes a priority and that there's funding. Now, you should know that even in a bad year, the Senate version of the budget, the state Senate version of the budget, went beyond the governor's budget plan and put $1 billion more than the COLA into the budget for the year we just started. That was their proposal this summer. And the governor in the negotiations objected and they got rid of it. But they did dramatically reduce those block grant cuts. And Sweetwater had huge impacts from the two. The big cut to the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant, but the bigger cut to the educational, what was the call, the fund that was supposed to be targeted for high unduplicated count school districts in the state. That was the block grant that was proposed to be cut even more. So we ended up having a dramatically smaller cut to the combination of the block grants in exchange for not maybe doing something in the base. But still, the base needs to be focused on, as the revenue picture, if we hope, improves, we want to make sure that we don't have that issue slip away from us. So that's in there. The special ed funding piece, just as I mentioned to you, this is the state platform, and it keeps reminding the state legislature that this is not just a federal issue, but a state obligation. They've done big things with special ed, so we don't want to look ungrateful. So you'll notice there's just one bullet to remind them special ed continues to be a really heavy priority for the district. Then there's the career technical education piece, which is in there. And that ended up becoming sort of a positive story. It was actually targeted for cuts, including the Golden State Pathways program, when they were looking for stuff to cut in this last budget iteration, and they ended up not cutting it at all. They kept protected the whole thing. But CTE will continue to be an issue as we go into next year. You guys have made that a priority here. And then Finally, there's two items. One is addressing staff shortages. And again, not enough people are talking about this at the statewide level, and to have a district articulate that crisis that we're having with being able to staff folks and what it means for a lot of the mandated programs and mandated requirements of districts to do things when you don't have the staff that you need to do them, that whatever the state does, they shouldn't make our problems worse. And so this helps to articulate that. But that the final one in here, again, is the work that you guys contributed to this, which is ensuring access to benefits, and that idea that state public policy should be to make sure that districts have the resources necessary to ensure that our part-time classified employees and other employees that are working not full-time actually have opportunities to be funded for the benefits that everybody else enjoys. And there's a movement, as you guys know, across all of employment to be looking and re-examining a lot of these issues. And you guys are raising that issue. You guys are amongst the very few people in the whole state that are raising that issue as an issue that we need to be looking at in education as well. So that's an overview of the state legislative priorities, which again, we did our best to reflect the things that you guys wanted added.
And Kevin, thank you for mentioning that. I do just want to state, for posterity's sake, that we definitely are using our voice, our advocacy voice, to ensure that we are, working with our state delegation to support our employees, because we depend on them. That is how we deliver instruction. That is how we deliver supports. That is how we deliver services. And so I think it's really important for us to be on the leading edge of that discussion. If we can do that through our advocacy voice, in addition to other ways that we support it. But I think this discussion here is focused on advocacy. I think it's important for us to share out that we stand in solidarity to support our employees, because they are our most valuable asset in terms of how we deliver instruction. So it's important to call out. So thank you for that, Kevin.
Right. And also, Dr. Gary, we had mentioned about the Department of Agriculture perhaps getting more resources from them to help offset some of the costs of providing meals for all of our students. And so we'd like to follow that and see how we might be able to push for at least some audiences with folks. We can be specific, perhaps get some guidance on how other districts, maybe in the country, how other organizations have lobbied the USDA for extra resources to provide healthy meals all around, and perhaps have those extra resources to provide ongoing benefits for the employees.
Yeah.
And I want to just take a moment through the work that Kevin and through the work of our nutrition services, while we were at Coast to Coast, the annual conference, the Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture actually identified Sweetwater as one of the kind of exemplars for some of the work we're doing locally. And so I think that's work to build upon. So I just wanted to note that, and I think Jenny wanted
And
to
I was just gonna, I know we've reviewed most of the things in the federal platform already as part of the legislative update, but as Kevin mentioned earlier, I think one of the things you just mentioned really about building in at the federal level, the importance of this, and it talks about the administration, but obviously all the departments are covered there, but we did build in a lot of information specifically on school nutrition at the federal level for that purpose.
Yeah, and I will just add one more thing to the point that you raised about, USDA and the profound impact they can have on, making resources go farther. It is important to note that the Secretary of Agriculture has very significant unilateral powers over a lot of the resources that we have, both in commodities as well as in funding. And it was exemplified, interestingly, under the Trump administration, but now the President Biden and his administration are sort of taking it to another level, is that under the Trump administration, when Secretary Pardue was the Secretary of Agriculture, we went to, and I think we might have talked about this during our last meeting when we were having the big conversation about adding a strong platform piece on school nutrition, that Sonny Pardue spearheaded the effort at the outset of COVID to say, let's feed all kids and relax a lot of the rules we otherwise had. And we did actually phone calls with his deputy secretary, who was over all the school nutrition stuff. And, they moved pretty quickly with a good deal of strong unilateral power they had, executive authority, to act to give waivers on a lot of the regulations so that we could actually do that. It's just weird where the politics has led us now, because things are just so polarized that now there's sort of this effort by some on the Republican side to want to, eliminate that altogether. But the Biden administration is taking full advantage of the executive power that they have and the authority of the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, to accelerate the ability to do more relative to resources to LEAs, but also resources to families through SNAP, as much as they can do. But there are efforts legislatively to try to constrain that as much. So there's definitely a fight going on back in DC. But even as it relates to commodities and distribution to local school agencies, there's a lot going on at USDA, and we want to stay active in that. And I think the federal platform sort of sunshines that as well. And to your point, Jenny, we did touch in the ledge update almost all these 5 items that are in the federal platform. The only 2 things we didn't really touch on was something that you guys wanted, which is the resources to improve student support services, mental and behavioral health. That's in here. And then as well, the sustained investments in ed technology, connectivity, and broadband. A lot of people think we solved all that, and we did not. A lot of the resources we got were one-time money. And we all know, anybody who knows anything about technology knows that there were not ongoing permanent investments in technology. So the notion that you keep up with technology as you need to refresh every 3 years simply isn't there. So not only do we have a cliff effect of a lot of the one-time money burning out this year and next year across the whole country, but we also don't have any ongoing investments in technology to make sure that the devices and everything all the progress that we've made gets sustained. So there's going to be a really important need for a voice from local school districts on those issues as well.
When I was on the San Diego City Council, we invited Arnie Duncan, who was Secretary of Agriculture, to come and tour community gardens throughout the San Diego area, and to offer lunch subsidies at park and rec programs, all that. Do you get a sense that this current secretary is inclined to come pay visits and walk the hallways and share lunch with the kids and learn what our issues are?
And we absolutely should invite him. I actually got to have lunch with him during there was a summit on education that was in New York. And I was at this event, and we all got our lunches. We all had these box lunches. And there he is sitting by himself. So of course, I read my title again on my business card and thought, I better get my butt over there and sit down and try to work.
Really?
So I did. I got a chance to sit down with him and have lunch, and we just talked about those kinds of roles that he's had. He ended up following up by having a really cool meeting with a delegation of school folks from California at the department. And you guys know that he actually did a stint as Ag Secretary before. And I think he served 8 years I think it was under the Clinton administration, or no, maybe it was the Obama administration. He served. And so, but they love opportunities to get out to the field. They absolutely love it. And so we ought to push that. But the same with our state school nutrition director, the idea of maybe bringing them both down and doing something in Sweetheart Water would really be exciting.
Okay. Farm Bureau. California has a Farm Bureau. What do they do? And do they offer advocacy or funding or guidance for creating community gardens on campuses or making food available to school districts?
I don't know how much engagement there is between the California School Nutrition Association and the Farm Bureau. LeAngela Reed, who's a partner in our firm, is the lead advocate for the School Nutrition Association. She would be able to better answer that question. I don't necessarily have that sort of background.
Angela Reed?
But I will. LeAngela Reed.
Okay, thank you.
So I can check with LeAngela on that, and we can tap into that. I will tell you, though, we've gotten a lot of questions about the Farm Bill and what the Farm Bill means to school nutrition programs. And even though most of what we care about is authorized in the School Nutrition Act, which is separate from the Farm Bill, The Farm Bill is important because it has all the provisions in it with regard to SNAP. And that is that, and we know that the SNAP, the eligibility rules on SNAP can create what we use for community-wide eligibility for the school nutrition program. So if that gets cut, which it's proposed to be cut dramatically, and it reduces the number of families that are eligible for it, it reduces what we call community-wide eligibility that I know Sweetwater must utilize.
So the earlier we start talking about these issues in the community and advocating, probably the better. We don't want to wait until something's already on the table and working its way through Congress or through the state legislature. We need to start now because we have this information now, correct?
Absolutely. And have our members, you know, the few members of Congress we have from the San Diego area know this is a priority.
And just FYI, literally today, we got an outreach by the San Diego Hunger Coalition, and they're working with different school districts on outreach, including our Nutrition Services Director, Mr. Eric Span, on getting some word out in terms of the PEBT program and making sure that students and families know that there's eligibility there. So there's some conversation going on locally around how we can partner with nonprofits or community partners. So Mr. Span is working on some of those efforts.
I'm going to a meeting tomorrow. What is it, 3 to 4?
Great.
Yeah,
Hunger Coalition?
I believe so.
Okay.
And it's just making sure that families know to activate those cards because they're going to be deactivated.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, so I think we've reached the point in the meeting. I don't know that we necessarily need a vote, but are there any questions or clarifications on the platform before it moves forward for the board consideration?
I was going to say, we did not touch on the state legislative, the pension policy and finance. We did not cover anything on there, other than there is no money.
In the platform, I believe we incorporated language that was previously there, which my understanding is still applicable, Kevin, in terms of just continued increases in costs of PERS and STIRS, and the percentage that's expected that districts pay continues to be increased on a proportional basis. So that, I believe there's some language in there around kind of maintaining that advocacy
Yeah.
posture.
We did update it a little bit. You'll notice the very first sentence updates it from what we had in the draft, which is that since the budget was actually adopted, and it's pretty shameful, but it's the very first budget that has provided $0 of any kind of relief whatsoever. Even the relief we got in the current year was through one of the block grants, and it was kind of like, thank you, but maybe not thank you, because it was basically giving us our own money and saying pay for it, when the help that we've gotten in prior years was the state general fund helping us, but not using Prop 98 school dollars to do it. That's the best way. So while we got a little bit of help and it wasn't the most ideal in the current year, we have nothing in the year that just started, 0.
Okay.
And so I updated it to just make that point, but it's a really important part of, obviously we take up a good chunk of the platform talking about it, and I didn't make reference to it, but it's a really good point.
We actually get a recommendation to
I think that's it.
To recommend that the board adopt the platform.
Yes, so Jenny, would you please share that?
I would ask if we could entertain a motion to recommend adoption by the board. So you would be recommending to the board that they adopt the 23-24 state and federal platforms as drafted, given you've made amendments in both of these subcommittee meetings, or in our first meeting.
Okay, so I would say, I'll do the first,
Okay.
And I'll second it.
and we'll vote, and we're done.
Aye.
Sounds like by voice vote and acclamation, this shall move forward to the full body of the board for consideration as a 23-24 platform for legislative platform and advocacy. With that, Kevin, I really want to thank you for being available to share kind of what's the word on the street out in the state's capital and the nation's capital. We very much appreciate the advocacy, support, and guidance. I think it's
You
been
bet.
invaluable to formulating how we approach the work.
Well, and then the other thing I wanted to add for you guys is These alleged platform from individual school districts are extremely rare. You guys have one now that's a nice model. We were asked by Clovis Unified whether or not anybody had ever done a district platform. We said, as a matter of fact, yes. They wanted to see what you guys had drafted. They're adopting a very similar platform. But of course, when I sent it to them, it said Sweetwater all over it. And they said, we like it, but we were wondering if you could put Clovis in it. So, but it's really a cool thing. You know, the other platforms we see by CSB and AXA have literally dozens and dozens of items. The idea that, even though there's a lot of really compelling issues out there, that we have a real focus on a smaller set of issues that we can articulate easily. The next step after adoption of this, we would really like to set up some either in-person meetings, which would be ideal, but at the very least, possibly some Zoom meetings where we have the subcommittee of the board, this group that's communicating with lawmakers, and maybe you invite others to join as well. We just got to obviously pay attention to Brown Act requirements, but the idea of having direct conversations with our elected officials, both at the state level and the federal level. And I know you guys see lawmakers in political circles and socially, but this is just like, let's focus on the issues for a few minutes. What does Sweetwater care about? What's in the platform, and share it with them. So that's our plan for sort of next steps.
And just kind of as we think of that kind of next step, also, I think what's really helpful is those leave behinds that we can leave for staff and the elected, I think are really helpful just as a reminder of what our platform is about and what we're advocating. And I know we did that both in Sacramento and when we did our visit to Washington, D.C. So again, I think those are all very helpful next steps as we want to make sure we are out there advocating for public education.
And Kevin, just so you know, that means you. That was in the last minutes, the board had just, before we do those visits, that we have a who we are and what we believe kind of piece on both the state and fed.
All right. So with that, I think we're ready to
We just need to schedule our next meeting.
yes,
Schedule
next meeting.
Okay. So we would probably schedule, what month are we in?
So we're in
August,
August.
September, October, November, so like a November meeting?
November?
Mhm.
Okay.
First week in November?
Could I make a suggestion and we ask Ms. Vicero to help with the scheduling of the logistics, and that way we can kind of get that squared away, because I know there's a number of, there's Kevin over there, we're going to invite different staff members as well to maybe have some presentations. I'm thinking Mr. Span perhaps, kind of there's any progress in nutrition services. That would be my suggestion.
Perfect.
Okay.
So next meeting will be in November, and we'll leave it open.
We'll have Ms. Vicero
Mhm.
provide, as she does with regular board meetings, or meetings that need to be called. The regular board meeting schedules are adopted at board meeting, to be able to provide logistics support. Okay, so with that, I think, anything else? Okay,
No.
I think we're ready to adjourn.
We are ready to adjourn at 4:56.
And you have the gavel.
Oh, I have a gavel.
Thank you.